Hey everybody, so just as I was about to make this video, news broke of an ongoing massacre in El Paso, which is a great city that I've visited multiple times, and the reports look utterly horrific, so I feel a little weird making this video, but it is still significant news, so here we go. Tulsi Gabbard has reached the 130,000 donor threshold to qualify for the next debate in mid-September in Houston. Remember, the first threshold to qualify for the first two debates over the summer was 65,000 donors, and that was doubled by the DNC for the September debates. So she's met that threshold. But remember, the lesson of Mike Gravel tells us that it's not sufficient to meet the donor threshold in order to make the debates. In fact, Gravel did reach 65,000 donors and was still excluded from the debates, while other people like John Delaney and Tim Ryan and others were granted entry by the DNC to the debates, even though they got vastly fewer donors than Gravel, which is incredibly arbitrary because you think if the intention was to determine who qualified for the debates based on levels of support generated in the populace, the better marker of that would be donors, because some of these polling results basically amount to rounding errors. I mean, if you get 1% in a poll, some of that really could be reduced to just statistical variation that isn't all that meaningful. If you get 0.4% versus 0.6%, that could be like a half a person. And yet the 0.6% result entitles you to get into the debates according to the convoluted cockamamie criteria that the DNC put forward for the first two debates. So you can thank the DNC for the pipsqueak John Delaney dominating the entire thrust of the debate seemingly on the first night this past week on Tuesday. Whereas Gravel, who, he's 89 years old and he has teens running his campaign, but he did generate enough excitement, largely on the internet, to at least meet the stated criteria that was set forth by the DNC. He didn't make it in the debate. So for the purposes of Tulsi, she now has to get 3 additional polls at 2% to qualify. She has one, which was a CBS battleground poll from New Hampshire in July. And to tell you how even more arbitrary these criteria are, there are additional polls by YouGov that have her at 2%, or at least 2. Those are national polls. But they don't qualify, even though YouGov qualifies when they do polls on behalf of CBS. So can somebody explain why? Because if YouGov, in coordination with The Economist, has Tulsi Gabbard at 2% in 2 separate polls, those polls don't count according to the DNC, but YouGov, partnering with CBS, does qualify. YouGov isn't any less credible by virtue of working with CBS versus The Economist. Either YouGov is credible or it's not. Generally, YouGov has reasonably accurate polling, and they are one of the few polling firms to actually identify a fissure within the Democratic coalition in 2016 after the primaries ended, where a large and underreportedly significant percentage of Bernie Sanders supporters were saying that they were not planning to vote for Hillary Clinton. And sure enough, those voters, you could argue, made the difference in terms of the ultimate result in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So the YouGov actually has a decent track record, and none of these firms are going to be perfect. They use different methodology, etc., which is why you have to kind of think about polls in totality. But because the DNC has placed a premium on these relatively trivial poll findings, you're now in this bizarre position where, although she has obviously generated support among a variety of metrics, including Google searches, I mean, people can discount that, but if she got the most Google searches after the first debate and now after this most recent debate, isn't that enough to tell you that there's at least sufficient interest to warrant her inclusion in the debates? But no, the DNC had to go through this process where basically they exalt these established media entities and and these polling firms as the people who are dictating who is included in the debate, and it really doesn't make any sense. Now, I often hear people saying, "Well, polls are bunk. I never get asked to participate in polls." Well, I mean, that's not surprising. An infinitesimal fraction of people in the entire country ever get asked to participate in polls. So just because you aren't personally polled doesn't mean that polling overall is lacking in credibility. Although what does lack in credibility is the way polls get used and framed and characterized and used as sort of like a plot device in media coverage, and now in how the parties structure their debate process. So that is open for contestation, but I urge people not to become nihilists and say that all polls are fake or whatever, because that's just not true. Yeah, the state polls in particular were off in 2016, especially in Michigan, Minnesota, and a couple other states, Pennsylvania. But in terms of the national popular vote, they weren't that off within the margin of error. I mean, maybe 2 or 3, 1 or 2%, 3% off in terms of underestimating Trump's total, but that's within the margin of error. So that's something to be expected. But as I mentioned, the state polls definitely were off, and that was much more significant in terms of the ultimate result. So what is the proper course going forward? If you'd like to see Tulsi Gabbard in the debates, I would. I'm not going to hide that, obviously. Basically, I think it's just a matter of boosting her profile, which I think the debate performance last week achieved, so that she's included in media narratives, and the very few people who participate in polls are inclined to say that they would back her. But there's not really any kind of tactical move that you can make beyond that at this point, because the whole process is, at essence, arbitrary. So, just wanted to give you a brief update on that. I'm now going to go back to Twitter, which converts into a mass shooting notification system a couple times a year, which is somewhat disturbing. And we'll see what's going on in El Paso. So anyway, have a good day.